So I'm very glad to be here, and I just wanted to start with a story. We've all, I think, worked in development, and one of my early experiences was I was working in Malawi in the early 1990s, and on a weekend decided to go to a game park in Malawi, which is a pretty desultory experience all around. But we got on this truck that was this old-fashioned open-bedded truck, and there was a guy driving the truck. And then there was a guy sitting in the back with us with this old World War I vintage rifle to protect us, so should there be any game. So we're driving along, and we're sort of bouncing along this very rugged dirt road, and the driver is like driving with his wheels in the ruts of this very rutted road, and I say, the driver is like driving with his wheels in the ruts. Why doesn't he get up out of the ruts? And the guard said, "Don't worry, we know what we're doing." Okay, great. And the road got worse and worse and more rutted. And I said, "Look, I know you think I'm this Western guy that's never driven a dirt road, but I grew up in Idaho. I drove four-wheel drives all over all the time. He really should get up out of the ruts." And the guard said to me, "We do this every day. We know what we're doing." Great. Like 3 minutes later, whoomp. Bottom of the truck goes up onto the center of the road. Wheels are fitting smoothly. We're completely high centered. We're completely stuck. 2-hour walk from the thing. As we're jumping down out of the truck, the guard says, "Damn, same thing happened yesterday." Now I realized that was a metaphor for what donors were doing too. Is after all, we go out and we're telling people, we do this every day. We do this in all kind of countries. It failed. Damn. Same thing happened last time we tried this. So I really like the metaphor of doing development differently, which is, countries, organizations have been at the doing development process for a long time now. We can't pretend that we're new at this. This has been going on. There's been something like a development agenda for over 50 years, and hence, if you haven't succeeded, you very much have to question fundamentally either what you're doing or how you are doing it. What I like about the metaphor of doing development differently is it's not giving up on some fundamental ideas of what development looks like. I fear that a lot of the world and a lot of the fashion has decided to not do development anymore, and rather than doing development differently. In the sense that there's a lot of attention to mitigating the consequences of the lack of development. And that's a very different thing than doing development. One can say, because we don't have development, human beings are suffering all kinds of, insults to their well-being, right? They don't have this and they don't have that and they don't have the other. And one can focus in some sense on mitigating the worst consequences of the lack of development. But that's not doing development differently. That's mitigating the consequences of the lack of development. It's not an alternative strategy. And one of the things that I was just in a discussion with some people who are very, very, very focused on human rights. And I'm all for human rights, just to get that out of the way. But our group is called Building State Capability. We're about building state capability, and we were trying to explain to them that, look, you can't deliver on a program of delivering human rights without the capability of the state. You can't say we're going to deliver particularly on any agenda of positive rights, of any attempt to endow people with a set of positive rights without the state. And then I realized, gee, is that really true? So as an empirical guy and as an economist, I was just reading this story, there's a new movie about a linguist that has to communicate with aliens. And this is like being an economist. We can only communicate with PowerPoint, which isn't necessarily how human beings communicate, but it's kind of like that. I want to emphasize that the development part of building the capability of the state is an integral part of any attempt to improve human well-being. And we sometimes get confused between the national development process, that's a social process of a series of transformations in the economy and the politics, in the capability of the state to administer and in social equality from sort of ontologically individualized measures of human well-being. But it turns out, if you just look at any measure of human well-being and any measure of state capability turns out to be an independently important factor in pretty much everything. So just even human happiness is quite, controlling for GDP per capita, controlling for the political, whether the politics is democratic or not. State capability has an independent effect on whether people are happier. And I started with this social progress index, which was this large attempt to build an index of human well-being that was completely GDP free. So let's completely deny that we're going to start with the premise that GDP is good, and let's have individual, let's build a social progress index that's a component of basic human needs, foundations of well-being and opportunity, and each of those is built up of these subsets like nutrition, water, shelter. So I started saying, how much of this social progress is really this fundamental national development transformation? And the answer is, at the aggregate level of the social progress index, the answer is all of it. Like, literally all of it. If you say, how much does GDP per capita, state capability, and whether or not you're a democracy explain of whether or not your country has a high social progress index, it's all of it. It's 100%. The correlation is 0.96. So they're indistinguishable between having successful national development in that threefold sense and achieving social progress. But what's more interesting to me and to this audience, I think, is that if you look at things like personal freedom and choice, safety, personal rights, tolerance and inclusion, and you ask, what's the transformation that matters? Is it GDP? This is the World Governance Indicator, government effectiveness, which is just one simple and easy measure of state capability, or is it whether or not you're a democracy? It really struck me that for these individual components, state capability is really the overwhelmingly important factor in the ability of a country to deliver on personal freedom, the ability of a country to deliver on personal rights, the ability of a country to deliver even on things like tolerance and inclusion. So I think the process of being able to create a state that's capable of delivering is an integral process to achieving all of our objectives, including objectives that you might not in the first instance think are really super important, like super correlated, like delivering on human rights. So even things like delivering on human rights actually require that there's a state that's able to provide even the foundations of being able to deliver on those things. And hence, so we want to think of not just an agenda for programmatic success. I don't think that Doing Development Differently wants to think of, I'm going to run a small project in a small country funded by whoever and have success at that project. That's programmatic success. I think Doing Development Differently is about doing development, which is this large-scale social transformation, differently. And that's an agenda for, over time, augmenting the capability of the state. And again, the state not just on its own through its own organizations, but also civil society and private sector actors, which requires a state capability to engage with. I think it's a process for not doing development, just mitigating the consequences of the lack of development, and not necessarily even a completely alternative definition of what development might mean, because I think the fundamental definition of national development as this process of acquiring state capability remains important for a variety of objectives, even ones that don't seem off the top of your head. If you said, how do I promote tolerance and inclusion, you might not think a capable state is an important part of that, but my argument is it is, and hence Doing Development Differently is part of that overall strategy of doing development to achieve the development objectives that I think will lead to accomplishing more effectively the human well-being objectives that we all share. Thank you very much.
I think our first panelist can come up now. We're going to.
Who's that?
You?
Oh.
You. Taylor Brown. and Jonathan Below. If you guys can just. Okay. Welcome to the first panel. My name is Salima Samji, and I'm the director of the Building State Capability Program, the home of PDIA. The first session is on who's doing development differently, and we have 4 panelists. The way it's going to run, for those of you who weren't here at the first DDD session, is we did 7:30s, but I see we're doing 7 minutes. You guys got 30 seconds less from last time. Everyone will speak for 7 minutes. We have a timer. Great, with an iPad, so you will be watching your time go down, and at 7 minutes they will stop. We will film the 7-minute presentation, but not the discussion, so we can feel free to ask whatever questions we have. I ask that you hold all your questions to the end after all the presentations, and then we can have an open discussion. With that, I think we're going to start with Jonathan Below, and he's going to discuss how the DDD principles have been working out in the humanitarian agencies. Thank you.
Great. So thank you very much for having me. I've been asked to speak about doing humanitarianism differently, and in the next 6 minutes and 50 odd seconds, I hope to provide an overview of some of the things that IRC is doing to become more adaptive. Secondly, I'll explore some of the things that are holding us back. And then finally, I hope to share a live example of the ways we're seeking to challenge the status quo. So at IRC, we've started an organisational change process which seeks to move us from monitoring of action to monitoring for action, with the intent of being able to course correct and become more iterative in the way that we implement. We've also invested in context analysis tools and, for example, social network analysis to help our field teams be able to better analyse local contextual dynamics and programme accordingly. We've established a collaboration with Mercy Corps and have researched, innovated and promoted adaptive practice. And there's an adapting aid report that we published over the summer. And finally, we're currently working with CEDA to test some adaptive donor and implementing agency arrangements. And I'll share a live example of one of those in a few moments. So, what's holding us back? Well, it's a truism to say that we work in uncertain and volatile contexts. And yet we often design programs as with an overconfidence that if we plan everything out and implement to that plan, then our programs will be effective, irrespective of changes in context. So you'll no doubt recognise the slide behind me. What follows is not an attack on our beloved log frame, but I hope to use this to explore some of the dynamics, some of the incentives at play. So the conceptual simplicity of the log frame has resulted in it being the #1 tool in the sector. It drives program design, monitoring to a certain extent, and implementation. But there are some problems. You well know the intervention logic behind, or the causal logic behind the log frame. If we implement these activities and these assumptions hold true, then we'll deliver these outputs. So foundational to the log frame is this column here, the assumptions column. The assumptions column is often that which gets neglected. It's the one which we come back to after a cup of tea if we've got time. Moreover, assumptions are often subject to optimism bias that proposal processes can engender. They can also encourage static or status quo projections of how the situation may unfold. The Ministry of Health staff will be paid on time. There will be uninterrupted access to project sites. I'm sure you recognise these assumptions, but they're often fail to provide a realistic interpretation of the reality. Now, this is really important because if our assumptions are wrong or are missing, then the causality is in jeopardy. So the proposal development process can also lead us to underplay the messiness of reality, to propose singular solutions, and then sell them as though they're the only way to bring about change, rather than one of a number of different pathways. USAID has recognised that development is not static and rarely linear, yet often our current programme models assume they are. We should allow projects to adjust in response to learning and contextual challenges. When it comes to implementation, there's often a reluctance to change, or an agility to change, and we can easily fall foul of log frame tunnel vision, where we implement plans rigidly even when the context means they're redundant. So I'd like to share with you one example of how we're trying to challenge this. CEDA back in 2005 published a great report entitled The Use and Abuse of the Log Frame, and it concluded by saying we must look for an approach which enables some of the logic of the log frame to remain, but avoids becoming an unwieldy, rigid instrument which locks actors into inappropriate courses of action. So this is our adapt frame. It's a somewhat delayed response to this plea. You'll see that we've done away with the assumptions column altogether, and instead are seeking to base program design on the drivers of change and an estimation of different trajectories, positive most likely and negative. We've built into this adapt frame pre-agreed flexibility with the donors that we're working with to adapt implementation plans based on changes to context and need. So how does it work? Well, first of all, you need to identify the drivers of change and also estimate what the possible trajectories may be. Now, this is not an attempt to predict the future. Pollsters have recently been told to shelve their crystal balls. It's more an attempt to estimate what might happen and explore the uncertainty of the context. Secondly, we seek to analyse the probability of each trajectory, and then thirdly, look at the implications of different trajectories and consider how we could respond to each differently. So adapt frame encourages teams to design their intervention based on the most likely trajectory for the context, but to infuse their design in different aspects of what the positive trajectory or a negative trajectory might look like. For example, our Niger team, when they estimated that might be some floods over the course of the project implementation period, built in a cholera contingency stock. Whereas our Nigeria team, who are also testing this, thought that the Joint Forces operation in Borno might increase some humanitarian access, and that would lead them to greater opportunity to access clients. And they built in needs assessments and mobile health clinics as one possible response. So the intent behind Adapt Frame is to offer different options for operating in challenging and changing contexts, different pathways for achieving identified outcomes, and also structured flexibility about how we implement. Monitoring and learning are central to how decisions are made under this process, with contextual indicators supplementing our project effectiveness indicators and regular reviews providing an opportunity for reflection. So, to sum up, it's hoped that Adapt Frame can help project teams to better analyse the dynamics of a particular situation, anticipate how these may evolve, and also be sufficiently agile to adapt to changes in context and need. Of course, Adapt Frame is still under development. It's not the answer, but we hope it may provide a challenge to some of the underlying incentives and dynamics that are holding us back. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Taylor, yep.
Okay.
Taylor's going to be next, and he's going to be
start the
talking about... No. You'll have your full 7 minutes. Don't
Okay.
worry.
Hamish and I were just joking about a lack of name tags, but it's really good to see so many familiar people. And maybe we were just joking that it's almost become like a bit of a cult, so we actually don't need name tags anymore. So, no, not yet. Hold on. So, okay, you can start now. So over the past 2 years, Palladium, which is the private sector organization that I work for, has worked systematically to integrate DDD principles into our people, our programs, and our processes. Before then, we had a portfolio that included a number of programs that were politically smart, locally led, and adaptive, but these programs operated in isolation. Their success was more the result of committed and highly effective teams and individuals, and serendipity than it was the result of a deeper corporate ethos or a capacity. Since 2014, however, we've taken a number of steps to integrate DDD principles into what we do and how we do it, to give our people and projects the resources and systems and support they need to be more politically informed, locally led, responsive, and adaptive. And I should add, we're definitely not alone in this. Other actors and private sector actors in this room and elsewhere are working to deliver development differently. So while I'm speaking from my experience and experience of one organization, I'm hopefully reflecting the progress made by others. And I've talked to others in preparation for this. So in the next few minutes, I'm going to briefly highlight some of the things that we and others are doing, examine some of the internal and external constraints we all face, and as requested, set out what we think is a key lesson for us going forward. So first, what are some of the things that we've been doing? So integrating DDD principles into an organization like ours and into our projects and programs entails changes at least 4 levels. First of all, it entails changes to the enabling environment, changes to donor priorities, strategies, systems, so that we as implementers have the license, latitude, and crucially trust to work in ways that are more experimental, that are more iterative, and in many cases more risky. And we'll talk more about this later. Secondly, it entails changes to our own internal systems so that we can allocate financial and human resources more swiftly and responsively, so that we can make decisions quickly, and so that we can really empower our teams on the ground to just get on with doing it. In practice, this has entailed changes to lots of important but unsexy back office stuff. Changes to how technical assistance contracts are made, to how payment milestones are negotiated, to financial reporting is structured, how work plans are designed, and how program data and information is stored, shared, continuously updated, and analyzed. Third, this change entails embedding and in some cases developing a new repertoire of frameworks, tools, and techniques to diagnose problems, to analyze contexts, to theorize about change, and to monitor and to learn. In our newer programs in Nepal, Tanzania, and Kyrgyzstan, for instance, we've developed an approach that uses a range of mini malleable theories of change that are piloted and refined on a rolling basis. This approach makes it possible for us to identify what Brian Levy might call our first, second, and even third best bets for how we might support a particular change process. Rather than committing resources to these initiatives up front, significant investment is only made once there is traction. In the tricky environment of Nepal, for instance, the pilot of this approach has already helped us to kickstart a number of stalled economic reform processes in conjunction with Parliament, the Ministry of Finance, federations of trade and industry, and crucially, labor unions. And last but not least, embedding DDD entails changes to our teams and to our people. We've realized that no matter how good our diagnostic frameworks, our M&E tools, and our back office systems are, DDD fundamentally depends on our people and their ability to work in locally led, iterative, and collaborative ways. Some of this can be learned, but some of it cannot. These skills and competencies are the special sauce of DDD. But as we've learned from sometimes painful experience, team leaders and other key staff that already possess this special sauce are scarce. So we're starting to be more systematic about how we recruit for DDD characteristics and provide training and mentoring to the people that we already have. Building on our experience of our Savvy program in Nigeria, we've started to use recruitment criteria that emphasize not just technical expertise, but analytical potential, networking and collaborative competency, and entrepreneurial zeal. In many cases, this process is leading us to recruit more youthful and more locally based staff than in the past. I've also been asked to highlight one key lesson from actually doing development differently, and I would say this focus on people and teams is that key lesson. So all of this is very much a work in progress. We're a big organization with lots of competing priorities, limited resources, and we have to demonstrate value to money both to our leaders and to our clients. But some of our teams and programs are still struggling to make this change. And as Lenny points out, DDD ain't easy. It's very hard work. But we are making progress, and the initial changes we're taking are making it easier for us to consistently be locally led, politically informed, and adaptive in our work. So let's go back to the bigger picture, to the external opportunities and particularly the constraints that shape our ability for organizations to do development differently. Overall, there are some significant openings, but also some strong tensions and headwinds. First, the opportunities. One of the most noticeable differences from when we met 2 years ago is that we no longer have to make a case for DDD. Most of the strategies and documents, program documents that come out from DFID, USAID, and DFAT that I see highlight the importance of context, the need for local leadership, and especially the need for adaptive and flexible programming. So in some ways, the intellectual case for DDD has been won. But scratch below the surface, and there's a great deal of uncertainty about what this means in practice and how to deliver it. And this is true for programs on the ground as well. But more importantly, if there are a number of significant tensions and contradictions we face as we try to do development differently, through donor-funded programs in particular, but more broadly. Some of these have intensified in the past 2 years, and some have even intensified in the past few weeks and days. These include the tensions between donor demands for simplicity, certainty, and surety when DDD approaches are all about complexity, uncertainty, and possibility. Second, tensions between rules and procedures aimed at enhancing flexible and adaptive programming and donor domestic political concerns. That is, do DFID's SMART rules get canceled out by the Daily Mail test? The tensions between calls for aid in the national interest and key DDD principles around working in support of locally owned and locally led development processes. The tensions between the need to invest in high caliber human resources and increased emphasis on keeping technical assistance levels and overheads low. And lastly, the tension between the need for DDD-style programs to take calculated risks and potentially fail, and the reduced donor appetite for risk and increased focus on downside rather than upside risk. So I hope we can explore some of these tensions in more depth throughout today's discussions. Thank you.
Next, Panthea Lee from Reboot's going to discuss open data and transparency communities and how DDD has been working out in those communities. Thank you.
Oh, can we, this is for later on. Can we just not have this for now? Yeah. Great, thank you. It's really good to be here. Reboot draws on ethnographic, political economy, and user-centered design approaches to inform our work. And we work in lots of different spaces. Open government, media development, civil society strengthening, social accountability. But today, we've been asked to speak about some of our observations on how doing development differently has been playing out in the open government and open data communities. So just to start out, for those that may be unfamiliar, open government is a sort of broad umbrella term. It's a global movement to push for greater government transparency, often through advocating for freedom of information legislation, proactive disclosure of government data, to then encourage and enable citizen participation, more informed citizen engagement with government based on this newly released data. And so the theory goes that, if we do this, citizens can then better engage with governments to be able to have, joint collaborations around sort of problem solving around governance challenges, whatnot. And this is not new. Transparency, participation, accountability, these are the, hallmarks of modern democracies. But what is new is that the recent growth in technological advancements, usage, whatnot, social media, big data, the ubiquity of mobile platforms has really seen this movement balloon all around the world. And who's familiar with the Open Government Partnership? Okay, so this is a 5-year-old multilateral initiative that has really been shepherding this global movement by securing concrete commitments from governments, usually over a 2-year time horizon, to advance open government. And so now it has about 70 national governments and 15 subnational governments as members. And it's really done a lot to build sort of global momentum and political interest in this space. And so Reboot has been working on open government and open data initiatives both formally through OGP and also sort of more informally through other development programs. And so a few observations. First of all, I think open government fundamentally encourages decentralized local problem solving. So the theory is if we can open up government data, we can give citizens access to the information they need to better engage with governments. We can then better organize citizens and civil society to then better engage and solve problems. And so OGP, as a body, sets protocols and parameters for government and citizen collaboration, but it doesn't intervene in local debates and processes, and that is a good thing. And I think OGP and sort of open government programs have really done an excellent job in establishing the space for coalition building, collaboration between actors on the, usually on different sides of the supply-demand divide that don't usually come together. And so its greatest successes have been in bringing together these actors for joint problem solving. It's done a really great job of creating the political interest and establishing and legitimizing a formal space for these actors to come together to problem solve. And it really sort of provides a framework for these actors to understand each other, to identify areas of shared interest and alignment, and to form alliances around common development challenges. And so recently we were working with OODI and Pearl in Nigeria around sort of the National Action Plan development process for OGP. And both Nigerian government officials and civil society actors said, we never have these opportunities to come together and sit around the table and debate these issues as we're doing now. We've been working in Mexico with the Office of the President, which is staffed by, people from civil society that typically would not join government under the Peña Nieto administration, but see this as an opportunity to make change on issues that they have long been fighting for from outside of government. Now, these are the positives. The open government movement has not been without its challenges. I think one thing is that it has largely been this movement has been largely defined, structured, and led by civil society actors, largely international ones, that bring sort of biases and assumptions about how their core audience government works. It emphasizes political commitments, but often overlooks the operational elements and the socio-political realities of how you actually implement this stuff. So, for example, OGP has been very successful in getting high-level political buy-in, but when it actually comes to the practicalities of implementation, it's often less targeted and sophisticated in understanding how policymaking works, how decision-making works. And also OGP often works through organized civil society to represent citizen interests. And so there's a bias towards advocacy organizations and national ones or ones funded by international organizations. And so that introduces bias into sort of the agendas that are being promoted. And so for all the talk of citizen participation, there's often quite limited interaction with actual citizens. And finally, the movement has been inspired by a lot of the technological innovations newly available: open data, e-procurement, mobile reporting, whatnot. Obviously, technology can help with a lot. It can be the shiny object that you introduce to then have conversations around policy, process, whatnot. But as development practitioners, we know that if the fundamentals aren't there, if we're starting with hammers, not nails, if we're not defining concrete use cases, if we're not identifying capacities to maintain that technology, these will ultimately fail. And so just, really quickly, I think one of the areas that we have seen the most impact for DDD in open government has been at the subnational level. And so the first slide, please. So one of the, so we've been working with a county government in Kenya that is a subnational member of the OGP. And, you know, when we first started working with them, they said, oh, open government. That means we need open data dashboards. That means we need e-procurement. We need open contracting, whatnot. And so, you know, I think the biggest barrier, first of all, was just getting over that. It doesn't need to be about sort of technology. These, you know, they assumed it was another international program that was coming to sell them something. And so we were working with government to identify things that they were already doing. So just really quickly, citizens had set up WhatsApp groups, basically, at the ward level. So each ward had a WhatsApp group, and where they were sort of lobbying government to open up information to, you know, surface grievances and complaints. And government was also setting up WhatsApp groups to coordinate response around, for example, El Nino, when roads were getting washed out. And we were saying, this is innovative, this is really exciting. They said, but this is not open data. This, you know, but it is. And so we were working then with government to figure out how do we institutionalize some of this. Next slide, please. To try and basically to take them through a design process on this is a local solution that is working really well, so how do we institutionalize this? How do we get the governor's buy-in and support around this? And then next slide, define sort of formal protocol to be able to understand what are the government offices that would actually benefit from this, road monitoring, health clinic monitoring, to take a look at citizen participation data that, you know, because of the devolution process, a lot of counties are now going through, to understand the intersection of citizen interests and needs, government need, and then to start defining sort of processes. And I think open government, OGP, and others have created a lot of space and political interest to do things like this. And I think that's where it's going to be most useful for the DDD community. Thank you.
Duncan Green, he needs no introduction. He's going to talk about Oxfam and the INGO sector.
I think 7-minute time limits plus jet lag is a devastating combination. It's just because we all just speak incredibly fast. People are basically asleep, which is kind of interesting sort of piece of theatre. Okay, so I'm going to speak incredibly fast on two things. One, I'm going to just briefly introduce a book, and it will be brief. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about Oxfam. So the book's just come out. It's called How Change Happens, and I was trying to work out how it fits with DDD. And I think it's basically going back from DDD rather than forwards and saying, what is the actual intellectual justification for this movement, which is out there? It's aiming at a broader audience. There are some on sale, but I have to tell you, in the interest of honesty, it's free to download. It's getting it's 3,500 downloads in the first 2 weeks. There's a lot of interest in this topic out there. And it's actually looking at the theory of change rather than the theory of action, or as well as theory of action. So it's actually looking at how change happens without aid and without donors, which amazingly is incredibly absent from a lot of donor literature. So looking at how systems evolve, states, international system, and so on. And then it goes on to the theory of action and the kinds of people we need to be, picking up on what Taylor was talking about, to work in these in more systems ways. The main differences with the DDD, I think, is that focus on endogenous change, theory of change rather than theory of action, but also power. I still think that the DDD movement is on one side of the Rao Kelleher power framework in the formal power bit and doesn't do nearly enough on the informal power bit. So Oxfam, because of its work on gender issues, has always been very strong on the informal side, and it's trying to get people into a more, I think, comprehensive, holistic view of how power shifts within communities and within countries. Initial impressions from 30 book launches so far, 2 more this afternoon, so I won't be here, I'm afraid. People feel that this is kind of justifying what they thought anyway, which actually is great. So it's actually giving people confidence that their anxieties about the way aid is happening and the way development is being portrayed actually are warranted. And so I think it's kind of a confidence booster more than a revelatory experience for people so far. Right, that's enough about the book. On Oxfam. I know, as speaking for Oxfam, I should just say Oxfam's great. We're totally across this, you know, and just hustle and pitch and impress, and that's probably what I should be doing to earn my wages. I don't think I can do that. Actually, I think listening to some of these presentations, I don't think we're there. I hope they're there. I wonder whether Oxfam is both too big and too small. So I think, on one sense, we're too big. I wrote a paper about the future of INGOs saying, how do you take a supertanker whitewater rafting with great difficulty, is the answer. But we're too small because we're dealing with the sticky middle in the donors. We're dealing with what I call the dandruff people, the people who just want to get home at 5 o'clock, go to the pub, don't want to deal with all this interesting, new, novel sort of stuff. If you're big and you're dealing with the senior people, then they all get doing development differently. I think this is a bit of a bubble, and we really need to stand back and say, how far has this actually percolated into aid practice? Because I suspect it's not nearly as much as we would like to think. So when I talk to academics or our staff, I hear Project Titus, log frame, linearity all the time. And we're taking a few nice examples and saying this is where it's all going. I'd need to be convinced about that, to be honest. What's going on in Oxfam? There is some stuff. We're not at a tipping point, but there's a lot of innovation bubbling up. A lot of it in new, how do you get past the parent-child dynamic, as a colleague called it, in aid? How do you get past that? I've got the money, I'm giving you the money, let's call ourselves partners thing. And I think it's about multi-stakeholder initiatives. It's how do you politically sterilize the power imbalance through convening bigger groups, program implementation units where everybody sits around the table. Finding ways to sterilize the power imbalance is quite important. Redefining success. So actually using MEL to monitoring and evaluation to measure women's empowerment, to measure the stuff that counts, and getting good at it and cheap at it is really going to be absolutely essential if we're going to sell this within and to donors. And real-time evaluation, yeah, that's coming in. Iteration is becoming part of the general deal. What is failing? Competitive funding bids. If you do this and you're up against somebody else and they're not doing it, you're more expensive and you're more vague. And that's really hard because the pressures are all on you to have unwarranted, unjustified certainty in what you're saying you're going to do. So I think we're still up against a huge set of negative incentives on this. It needs advanced project management skills, and sometimes we're struggling to even find the project management skills. So, yeah, you're asking people to be really brilliant at this kind of stuff and embedded and systemy when they just can't even, they're struggling to just manage a budget properly. So I think, where are we going to find the people for this? I absolutely agree that HR is at the heart of a lot of this. One of the frustrating things, good ideas don't spread. I found loads of examples of this, one-offs bubbling up in Oxfam, sometimes spontaneously, usually by accident, someone's just had a good idea, and I make a big noise about them and it doesn't spread. And I want to know why. I haven't yet nailed down what is the thing that's stopping good ideas spreading. Lessons, this is all about mindsets, it's about permission, both from the money people and internal leadership, agree with that, and risk doesn't go away. So we can't just sort of deny risk and say, oh, let's get more risky, because then we won't get funded. So I think a bit of a reality check, I think, on this one.
Thank you. With time to spare, Duncan, that was super fast.
Can I do the book again?
Well, you can. You had all of your 7 minutes. Thank you very much. Before we open up, I just had a question for Jonathan and for Taylor. I was wondering if you could speak more to the challenges with getting people to use your adapt frame and for this mini malleable theories of change. Change is generally hard. How do you get people in Nepal to actually do this, right? If you could just speak to that. Go ahead.
Great, sure. So I think and this picks up on something that Duncan said. I think there's industry processes.
Can everyone hear him? Do we need to use mics? All right, do you want to? Is it on? Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you.
So this is picking up on something that Duncan touched on. I think industry processes, tools and incentives have created an epidemic of pretty rigid mindsets within our sector. And so I think there's quite a bit of unlearning to be done. That said, contrasting this, there's also a number of so-called rogue kind of field operators who are actually entrepreneurs who are doing some of this stuff, and it comes pretty intuitively to them. I think that it's about trying to pinpoint some of the key parts of the system that are really holding back those mindsets, and then addressing those, and that's why we've focused on the log frame.
Good. I usually have a booming voice, so I don't need to use a microphone, but I'll use it just in this case. So I think your question was about how it is that you get people around the table, or how you use this sort of mini malleable theory of change. And I think Duncan had mentioned, there's theories of action, there's theories of change, and you need to keep both of these in mind back and forth when you are doing development differently in practice. The framework that we've developed in Nepal is both a framework, as in an empty set of boxes that you fill in and work through, and it's a process in terms of getting the right people together to work through that. And I think the key starting point with it is that doing the right sort of analysis, the political economy, the actor network analysis, to figure out a few instances where we think we can get traction to start with. So there was something around special economic zones in Nepal, where legislation had been stalled for a range of very specific and very general reasons in Parliament, and there was an inability of previous actors to get people around the table. And so that analysis was combined with having the right sort of people in the team. So one of the key players within the team that was brought in was somebody who was very, very well connected, and we see this often in doing development differently project, the Jaime Faustino type characters that are able to convene different actors across the political and the bureaucratic and the social spectrum. And so he was able to use his networks to get people around the table and start working through this framework, which can be very donory, but it can also be very intuitive in terms of, well, how do we get from here to there? What are the first steps to move this process along? And coming up with different ways in which that could happen. Is that through Parliament? Is it through actually getting the unions and the parliamentarians together? And what are those steps that take place? And then it's going back to that in a very iterative way every few weeks to see how it's moving along, and then releasing the technical assistance or the mediation process to bring people together along that until it worked its way through Parliament, and until there was a process that actually brought all those people together around starting to deliver that SEZ expansion.
Great.
Yep.
Thank you very much. I was wondering if you had questions for each other as panelists before I open it to everybody else? No? Great.
I'm
sorry,
curious
yeah.
as to
Go
how
ahead.
you, so Duncan, to what you said, doing development differently means that your proposals are more vague, they're more expensive, they're sort of process oriented, when then the donors come and say, but what are we getting? You're like, I don't know what we're getting.
Join us on the journey.
We will see, but then you get points docked for that, and ultimately people said, well, they had a specific thing that we could go on to, like, what do we do about that? 'Cause that's the thing
Could
you
you
think-
use Penta? Could you use the mic, please?
Oh, yeah. Sorry, I'm just wondering what you do about the sort of donor pushback around, well, this is vague, this is process-oriented. We agree with all of this in theory, but in practice, we need to justify it upwards, or what do we do about that? Because we get that pushback all the time.
So I think you think of this as an influencing question. So you need to influence the people who are the blockers in the donors, and you need to apply all your usual influencing techniques. So what kind of evidence persuades them? Who scares them? Who do you need to get to talk to them? What kind of alliances will get them moving? And then you have to show success, and you have to build examples of good donorship, like we're doing here. And this kind of stuff starts to percolate down, but it doesn't just happen automatically. So I think it needs a conscious influencing strategy to get down to the bits of the donors and the bits of the NGOs and the other players who are currently not hearing this stuff. It doesn't just happen because of evidence, I'm sorry to say.
Great. Any other questions? No? All right. We're going to take a set of 3 questions, and then we'll get the panelists to respond. You, Neil, and then we'll start there.